Some killers act because they lose control in a single moment. And some killers act because they know, whatever they do, the system will not stop them in time. Tyrone Thompson was the second kind. He had attacked Mackenzie Anderson before, he had been arrested, he had served time in prison, and he had just been released. There was an apprehended violence order in place, keeping him away from her. He breached that order more than 8 times and faced no consequences. 2 weeks after his release, he climbed onto the balcony of her apartment using a ladder with a knife in his hand. And within 3 minutes, what happened inside that apartment left even the most experienced investigators unable to stay composed while reading the forensic report. Her young son was still inside that apartment. This is not a story about a man who simply lost control. This is a story about a system that saw every warning sign and still failed to stop it in time. Mackenzie Anderson, 21, lived in an apartment in Mayfield, an ordinary residential area in Newcastle, New South Wales. She was the single mother of a 23-month-old son. At 21, she carried everything a young mother has to carry: work, a small child, everyday life, all while trying to get out of a relationship that had long stopped being safe. Those who knew Mackenzie described her as young and full of energy, someone who always put her son above everything else. Tyrone Thompson, 25, was her former partner. This was not an ordinary breakup. Their relationship had a documented history of violence, a history known to police, known to the courts, a history the legal system had already dealt with. Thompson had previously been convicted of assaulting Mackenzie, threatening her, and damaging her property. He had served 4.5 months in prison, and on his release, there was an apprehended violence order, an AVO, keeping him away from Mackenzie. But that order was breached, not once, not twice, more than 8 times. And every single one of those breaches carried no consequence for Thompson at all. So the question is this: if a man has assaulted his girlfriend, has served time in prison, has been ordered to stay away from her, and breaches that order more than 8 times without consequence, then who exactly is this system protecting? That was the situation on the night in March 2022 at Mayfield, Newcastle. This is the heartbreaking tragedy of Mackenzie Anderson. One night in March 2022, Thompson was at Mackenzie's apartment along with another man. The two of them were sitting drinking. What had happened inside that apartment before that? What conversation, what conflict, was not fully recorded. But at some point that night, Mackenzie made a decision. She wanted him to leave. Mackenzie asked Thompson to go. He left, but visibly unhappy about it. No one knows what was going through his mind in those moments, right after he walked out of Mackenzie's home. But what happened next made one thing clear. He had no intention of accepting rejection or being told to leave. Security camera footage captured Thompson returning to the building at around 10:10 p.m. This time, he did not use the front door. He used a ladder to climb onto the balcony of Mackenzie's apartment. He went inside, then left again, but this time, he took her set of keys with him before walking out. That was not a random act. He was making sure that the next time he came in, she would not be able to stop him. Just minutes later, he returned for a third time. Neighbors began hearing screaming from Mackenzie's apartment. A woman looked out and saw Mackenzie standing at the window, both hands beating repeatedly against the glass, as if trying to break through it. According to the witness, her face looked utterly terrified, as if she were in a state of panic. The friend who had left earlier also returned to the apartment. He walked in and found Thompson standing over Mackenzie, in a scene he could not put into words. The 000 call was made straight after. Police and an ambulance were immediately dispatched to Mackenzie's apartment in Mayfield. When police arrived, they found Mackenzie Anderson in an extremely critical condition. They immediately began efforts to save her right there at the scene. And meanwhile, Thompson was still inside the apartment. He did not flee. Thompson stood there and shouted, "Help me, she's dead." But moments later, while officers were doing everything they could to save Mackenzie, He continued shouting, "I'm bleeding everywhere. Mate, please check my blood pressure. Mate, please pay attention to me." Mackenzie was dying right in front of them. He asked police to stop trying to save Mackenzie and attend to a small cut on his own hand. He did not flee and did not try to hide anything. Officers immediately recognized he needed to be held for the investigation. He was required to remain at the scene while police began securing the entire area. During that time, Thompson was not silent. He showed no remorse, and he did not ask about Mackenzie's condition. Instead, he shouted for police to attend to the small cut on his own hand. Once the scene had been secured and officers had recorded enough initial information, Thompson was formally taken into custody, beginning a legal process whose outcome, though determined early, would spark far more controversy than anyone could have imagined. The entire apartment was sealed off. Police controlled every entry and exit point to the building. No one was permitted access to the area while the crime scene examination began. Police immediately took Mackenzie Anderson to hospital in a critical condition. Doctors and medical staff did everything they could, but her injuries were beyond saving. Mackenzie Anderson did not survive. She died at the age of 21, leaving behind her 23-month-old son, her mother Tabitha Ackritt, and an apartment in Mayfield that had become the scene of a case all of Newcastle would never forget. Immediately after being notified of Mackenzie's death, police formally opened a murder investigation, and the entire apartment became a crime scene, requiring a full forensic examination. The crime scene examination team worked for many hours inside Mackenzie's apartment. The entire scene, every corner of every room, every surface, was documented and examined. Biological evidence, fingerprints, the weapon, and related items were all collected under strict procedure. One of the most important discoveries at the scene was the ladder, physical evidence showing Thompson had prepared to break in, rather than returning by chance. The stolen keys were also a significant detail recorded, showing Thompson had a clear plan before his third return. Mackenzie's body was taken to a forensic facility for formal examination. The autopsy results later confirmed the brutality of the attack, figures in the forensic report that gave pause even to those who had worked in the field for many years. Mackenzie Anderson suffered extensive injuries across her body, all occurring within an extremely short period of time. The cause of death was determined to be these severe injuries. There was no doubt about the nature of what had happened. This was a murder, carried out with a level of brutality that even experienced investigators could not remain unaffected by. At the police station, Thompson was formally interviewed. What he said, or did not say, during that interview was not fully disclosed to the public. But what he had already done at the scene said everything. Neighbors were interviewed by police to record statements about what they had heard and seen that night. The woman who had seen Mackenzie beating her hands against the window described the scene. Mackenzie's face, her hands, and the terrified look in her eyes that this woman would never forget. The friend who had found Thompson standing over Mackenzie also gave a detailed statement about what he saw when he walked into the apartment. And from records already held in the system, police now had the full history of the relationship between Thompson and Mackenzie, the previous assaults, the AVO breaches, the earlier prison sentence, and the date Thompson had been released. All of that information began coming together, and the picture became clearer than ever. The formal investigation focused on reconstructing the entire sequence of events that night, and further still, the entire history of the relationship between Thompson and Mackenzie. The building's security cameras became key evidence. The footage showed clearly Thompson arriving at the apartment, being asked to leave, returning the first time by climbing the ladder onto the balcony, leaving a second time, then returning a third time after having stolen the keys. 3 returns, 3 deliberate decisions, not a single impulsive moment. Investigators also pulled the full legal record relating to Thompson and Mackenzie, including previous police call-outs for earlier assaults, the 4.5-month prison sentence, and, in particular, the more than 8 breaches of the AVO that went unpunished. This final detail, more than 8 breaches, no consequences, became one of the central points of the entire case. Not only evidence of Thompson's behavior, but a bigger question: why didn't the system act while it still could? Faced with the full weight of the evidence, security camera footage, witness statements, forensic findings, and his prior record, Thompson had no other option. He pleaded guilty to murder. Based on what was reconstructed from the evidence and statements, that night unfolded as follows. Thompson and another man were drinking in Mackenzie's apartment. Mackenzie asked Thompson to leave. He left, but returned shortly after and climbed onto the balcony using a ladder. The second time he left, he took Mackenzie's keys with him. That was not a random act. It was preparation for his next return. When he came in for the third time, Mackenzie tried to get out. Neighbors saw her standing at the window, both hands beating against the glass, trying to escape, trying to call for help, but no one arrived in time. In that brief window of time, Mackenzie had no chance at all. When the friend returned and discovered the scene, Thompson was still standing there. And when police arrived, Thompson was still standing there, demanding they attend to the small cut on his hand. The case file on Mackenzie Anderson is one of the most complete cases imaginable. Security cameras captured Thompson's entire movements that night: the 3 returns, the ladder climb onto the balcony, the theft of the keys. Witness statements: the neighbor who saw Mackenzie beating on the window, the friend who found Thompson standing over her, matched perfectly with the camera footage. The autopsy results confirmed the extent and nature of the attack, more than enough to rule out entirely any argument that this was a moment of lost control. This was a deliberate, sustained, and relentless attack. Thompson's prior record, including his earlier prison sentence for assaulting Mackenzie herself, and more than 8 unpunished breaches of the AVO, was entered into the case file as evidence of a man with a systematic history of violence. And most significantly, Thompson had pleaded guilty. There was nothing left to argue about whether he had done it. The only remaining question was what price he would pay. The New South Wales Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions charged Tyrone Thompson with murder. This is the most serious charge in the Australian legal system. The prosecution built its case on the full record. Not just what happened on that night in March 2022, but the entire systematic history of violence Thompson had inflicted on Mackenzie. They argued this was not a random or impulsive killing. It was the result of a long chain of controlling, threatening, and violent behavior, of which the night in March 2022 was simply the final point. Because Thompson had pleaded guilty, no contested trial took place. The case went straight to sentencing. The sentencing hearing took place at the Supreme Court of New South Wales. Justice Richard Weinstein presided. The prosecution presented the full body of evidence: the forensic findings documenting the brutality of the attack, the security camera footage, and the statements of eyewitnesses, and called for a sentence that reflected the true seriousness of the offense. They also emphasized Thompson's history of abuse, his repeated unpunished breaches of the AVO, and, in particular, the fact he had been released from prison just 2 weeks before committing the offense, after serving time for assaulting Mackenzie herself. Mackenzie's family, in particular her mother, Tabitha Akrit, were present at the hearing. Tabitha sat in the courtroom, looked up at the judge, and waited. Thompson's defense, led by barrister Richard Wilson SC, accepted the plea. Thompson had pleaded guilty. There was nothing to dispute on that point. But they argued over the sentence. The defense argued there were mitigating factors that needed to be considered, including what they called Thompson's diminished degree of moral culpability. They argued the sentence sought by the prosecution was too high and that comparable sentences in similar cases would be lower. This was an argument that, on hearing it, felt to Tabitha Akrit like a slap in the face. An attack of a brutality, clearly documented in the forensic record, carried out in front of a 23-month-old child, and the defense was speaking of a diminished degree of moral culpability. Justice Weinstein listened to all parties, and then he delivered his sentence. Justice Richard Weinstein handed down his sentence on Tyrone Thompson. Maximum sentence: 22 years and 6 months in prison. Non-parole period: 15 years and 6 months. Earliest possible release: March 2038. Outside the courtroom, Tabitha Akrett, Mackenzie's mother, wept. Not out of relief, out of outrage, she said, when a judge rules that 15 years non-parole is enough for the brutal murder of a woman in front of her 23-month-old child, we have a serious problem in Australia. The Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions appealed, arguing the sentence was too lenient. On 27 August 2025, 3 judges at the Court of Criminal Appeal considered the appeal. Chief Justice Andrew Bell, Justice Belinda Rigg, and Justice Sarah Huggett were unanimous. The appeal was dismissed. The sentence stood. The reason given: the sentence fell within the range of recent sentences for comparable offences. Tabitha Akrett stood outside the court after that ruling and said, "Today is a deeply painful day. I fought with everything I had, but today, that wasn't enough. I will not stop. This fight is not over." And she did not stop. On 16 October 2025, 3 years after Mackenzie's death, the New South Wales government stood alongside Tabitha Akrett and announced a new bill, a minimum non-parole period of 25 years for anyone convicted of murder within an intimate relationship. This is the toughest sentence of its kind anywhere in Australia. That is Mackenzie Anderson's legacy, not because the system changed itself, but because her mother refused to let it stand still. Tyrone Thompson will not be eligible for release before March 2038. He will be 41 years old by then. Mackenzie Anderson will forever be 21. And her 23-month-old son, the child who was in the apartment that night, will grow up without his mother. A sentence of 15 years non-parole, one the appeal court said, fell within the normal range and reflected community standards. In your view, does that reflect the true value of a woman's life? And a second question: when a man breaches an apprehended violence order more than 8 times without consequence, then 2 weeks after his release, kills the very woman he was ordered to stay away from, whose responsibility is that? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read all of them. The Mackenzie Anderson case is not a story about a killer who appeared out of nowhere. It is a story about a system that saw everything and did not do enough. The first lesson: an apprehended violence order is not a shield. It is only a piece of paper. Mackenzie did everything she was told to do. She reported it to police. She sought a protection order. She took Thompson to court. He went to prison. And on his release, there was an AVO keeping him away from her. But he breached that order more than 8 times. And each time, there were no consequences. Nothing changed. No one intervened. That piece of paper did not protect Mackenzie. And that was not her fault. The second lesson: domestic violence follows a pattern, and that pattern can be recognized before it is too late. Thompson did not begin as a killer. He began with smaller acts: control, threats, physical assault. Each time, he escalated one step further. Each time he wasn't stopped, he escalated one step further again, until that night in March 2022, when there was nothing left to stop him. This is not an unusual pattern. According to Australian statistics, in the 5 years to June 2025, 59 people were killed by a current or former intimate partner in New South Wales, 42 of them women. And in the majority of those cases, there had been earlier warning signs the system had missed. The third lesson: the system changes when someone refuses to stay silent. Tabitha Akrett lost her daughter in March 2022. She had every reason to fall apart, and no one would have blamed her if she had. But instead, she stood up and fought. She met with the Premier. She spoke to the press. She lodged a complaint with the Human Rights Commission. And when the appeal failed, she did not stop. 3 years later, the New South Wales government stood beside her and announced a minimum 25-year non-parole sentence for murder within an intimate relationship, the toughest such sentence anywhere in Australia. That is not a complete victory. There is no complete victory when Mackenzie is no longer here, but it is proof that the system can change when someone refuses to let it stand still. And that is what Mackenzie Anderson, though no longer here, left behind for every woman who came after her.